All right, learning target 3 is solving quadratic equations using square roots. Now, the question here is, why do we solve quadratic equations for y equals 0? Well, if we think about a graph, when y equals 0, what are we finding here? We're finding what x is, right? And we call those the x-intercepts. We call them either the x-intercepts. So in quadratics, our graph is going to look like this. We're finding the 2 points where the graph crosses the x-axis. So in quadratics, we find the roots. So just write down roots for right now, and we'll talk about that more in class. Our first way to solve quadratics is going to be to use square roots. So you already know what the square root is, and that word root comes from these roots, okay, the roots of a quadratic. So we're going to solve quadratics using square roots. So we're going to solve these equations when y equals 0. So if we have x squared equals 16 plus 0, then we're going to try to get x by itself. Okay, and we're already close because x squared now just equals 16. And we have to think about what's the opposite of squaring, because if we had 2x, we'd divide by 2 because the opposite of multiplying is dividing. If we had 2x plus 6, we'd minus 6 from both sides because the opposite of adding is subtracting. So the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So we're going to square root x squared, and we're going to square root 16. Now the square root of x squared is just going to be x, but the square root of 16 is going to be plus or minus 4. What I'd like you to get in the habit of writing is x equals positive 4 and x equals negative 4, to remind yourself that you're always going to have two answers for quadratics. Not always, but almost always going to have two answers. Okay? Then here, if y is 0, then we'd have x squared minus 81 equals 0. So if I add 81 to both sides, then I have x squared equals 81. And to get rid of my x squared, I'm going to take the square root of x squared and the square root of 81, and I'm going to have x equals either positive 9 or negative 9. And I'm going to write it as x equals positive 9 and x equals negative 9 to remind myself that I will have two answers. Okay? This one, if we make y 0, we have x minus 2 squared plus 1 equals 50 plus 0. Okay, so if I minus 1 from both sides, then I have x minus 2 squared equals 49. Now, this quantity is squared, so I cannot add 2 to both sides before I get rid of the square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to square root this whole thing. So x minus 2 squared. And then I'm going to square root 49. Now, the square root of x minus 2 squared is just x minus 2. But the square root of 49 is both positive 7 and negative 7. So we have two equations now. Okay, here's where we branch off. We have x minus 2 left, that equals 7, and we have x minus 2 that equals negative 7. So anytime you have a binomial squared, you're going to end up with two different equations before you end up with two different answers. So here we just had an x squared, so we had two of the same, just the positive and negative of the same answer. Here we're going to end up with two different answers because when we add 2 to 7, we get x equals 9. But when we add 2 to negative 7, we get x equals negative 5. And those are our two answers for this one. So when we have a binomial squared, we'll have two different numerical value answers. When we have just an x squared, we'll have the same absolute value, but just a positive and negative. So before class, try this. This one you'll have a positive and negative the same number, positive and negative the same number. Here you'll have two different numbers. And then if you want to try doing some of this on con, you can do the solving equations by taking the square roots.